Okay, here we are. Going to try something different today. Going to just walk and talk. Going to do one of these bonus episodes where I talk about something that I've been working on this week, which is preparing for our philosophy group meeting, talking about Edmund Burke. Now, of course, I'm no expert in these things. In fact, I knew hardly anything about Burke. I knew hardly anything about Edmund Burke before I started this week. I had some vague recognition that he had an importance in American conservative view of politics. But I learned a lot this week from the people who were there, some retired academics who really knew their stuff. And of course, my sole purpose in attending was to try and bring a Christian aspect, a Christian perspective, if you like, to the life of Burke himself. What I've discovered in all my interactions, whether they be art or otherwise, that because the people we're studying generally have an implicitly deep Christian worldview, that sometimes the obvious is missed. So today I'm actually recording this walk and talk in a place called Lytham Hall, based nearby to where I live. A place where I used to actually come with Ella every single Saturday morning, and we do park run together. I did about 135 park runs here, finishing about 3 years ago when we both retired. Ella did pretty much all of those, maybe missed 6. Hi. But it's particularly fitting that we're visiting this place called Lytham Hall because it's in a Georgian listed building. It's not actually owned by the National Trust. It's owned by a local charity and looked after and maintained by a group of hundreds and hundreds of local volunteers, both the grounds and the building, of which my wife is one. She volunteers in the kitchen garden. And you'll get a sense of why I chose here, because this is a Georgian house built at the time, roughly at the time of when Edmund Burke first became a member of Parliament. And as we round the corner, there it is, we see it in the distance. So for this week's discussion group, we delved into the life of Edmund Burke, and particularly his book Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was written in 1790. I have to admit, when first navigating through Burke's writings, it was no easy feat. His train of thought, his long linear thinking and the frequent jumps he made it quite a challenging read. Also, the archaic English language didn't help matters. And reading him, first person, if you like, it became apparent to me why many choose to really just quote Burke rather than trudge through the entirety of his work. But it's worth drawing attention to the fact that Burke's writing contained plenty of references to Christian and biblical themes. And while he's not considered really a theologian, I suppose, his work does cover a broad range of topics, including what we would categorize today as political philosophy, as well as theology. And there are frequent instances where he incorporates religious, moral, ethical, if you like, considerations into his arguments. His most famous quote, I'm sure you've heard it, is that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil, is for good men to do nothing. This quote emphasizes the Christian aspect of moral responsibility, accountability of individuals to stand up against wrongdoing, aligning perfectly with the Christian principle of justice and righteousness revealed first in the Old Testament and then incarnated in the life of Jesus. If you do decide to go and read any of his texts or books, my suggestion is perhaps you focus on a selected works or parts of it, best of that type of thing. Because I have to say that despite the slog of reading through his book, it has to be said his ideas are substantial. And I've compiled my notes. I came to recognise their richness. Okay, a little bit about his biography. Edmund Burke was born in Dublin in 1729. His dad was a Protestant and his mum was a Catholic. That's an interesting mix, particularly in Ireland. And after dabbling in the law in London, he decided to study literature and philosophy. He became and befriended someone called Samuel Johnson, a huge figure in the literary world. He was noticed by him. That Samuel Johnson is that guy behind the epic first dictionary of the English language in 1757. But Burke himself, he wrote some early pamphlets where he commented on society's foundation, and it was those that caught Johnson's eye. Then in 1760, Burke decided to get into national politics and was in fact elected to the House of Commons, and he served there for 3 decades. During the 1770s, he backed the American colonies perspective, and he was not, on record, as not a fan of George III and his continual, as he saw it, interference with the House of Commons independence. If we fast forward another 10 years to 1780, and Burke at this point is all about trying to restrain the power of the crown, thinking that it would, in fact, particularly George III at that time, was a threat, if you like, to the well-balanced English constitution. Then, of course, the French Revolution hit, and Burke went from, just eye-rolling opposition, if you like, to wanting to, standing so against that he actually broke away from the Whig Party in the process. Burke had a thing, you see, for tying virtues to manners and giving importance to religious institutions, as they were the things that kept the state in check. He spilled these thoughts into 1756 work, A Vindication of Natural Society, where in it he took a swing at British government's moves in the American colonies, especially their tax policies. Burke didn't mind the fact that the colonists resisted the British ruling system, but he wasn't sold on the whole idea of American independence, and that probably comes from the fact fueled by his opposition to the French Revolution. So you can see the coaches and the cars are starting to arrive today, and you can see the hall. As I say, I'll go into lots more detail because my wife volunteers here at least once a week, and I tend to come actually do my editing of the podcast inside the tea rooms in the cafe. So I'll tell you a little bit more about it if I film any more episodes around here, if this turns out to be interesting or popular. Okay, the book we studied this week as a group was his reflections on the revolution in France, which of course, when he published it, sold like hotcakes. It was very well selling, and in it Burke basically argued that the French Revolution was in fact turned out to tear the very fabric of what he considered good society apart, wrecking traditional state and social institutions. He also wasn't a fan of how the French Revolution treated the church in this process. His whole perspective made him the top thinker in what was called the Conservative faction of the then Whig Party. That's the party in the UK and before the Conservative Party. He actually caused a fraction and a break which he cheekily called the Old Whigs, throwing aside the pro-French Revolution version of the Conservative Party, who were called the New Whigs. In the 19th century, both Conservatives and Liberals were giving Burke a thumbs up. And now today, interestingly, in the 20th century, both Conservative Liberals do claim their antecedents, if you like, from Burke. Let's think a minute about Burke's conservatism as I see it. Burke's never employed the use of that term because in that time it was not an out-and-out political idea. He nevertheless, and his principles are the source for most modern conservative beliefs. It was in France after the defeat of Napoleon that the words conservateur and in English conservatives were coined to describe a concept of policies founded on the idea of this notion. Conservatism then was deemed a method, if you like, of guarding and preserving a country's institutions. These terms passed into English politics during the 1820s and into American politics and discussions during the 1840s, on the model of Burke's conservative statesman being someone with a disposition to preserve that which is good, but also having the ability to reform. The key passage from both describing this concept is found in this book we read, Reflections on the Revolution in France, particularly his denunciation of the National Assembly. Burke's worldview is deeply rooted in belief in a universe ordered by a divine design, a providential understanding of history. He perceives history as the unfolding of God's will, unveiling divine purposes for humanity. In Burke's view, the state plays a crucial role in refining human qualities, and he opposes any notion of social engineering. He argues that moral issues in fact emerge within concrete human conditions, emphasizing the importance of those traditions as the carrier of what he calls universals originating from God. This perspective resonates greatly with me and the biblical principles that I pulled out in my recent exploration of the book of Leviticus a couple of seasons ago in the Bible Project Daily podcast. In recognizing the principles that lie embedded within the Christian religion, Burke underscored it as a source of moral strength. He believes that it is those values that were handed down through generations, acknowledging the Christian religion's influence on shaping character and guiding behaviour. Burke's skepticism extends to ambitious government schemes that were very evident in the French Revolution as he saw it, their desire to create a uniform system. He contrasts this with his admiration for the intricate English system, highlighting its finely tuned rights, balanced evolution as he saw it across centuries, which he associated with this thing called conservatism. Burke aligns more with traditional conservatism today, prioritizing practical knowledge accumulated over generations as that which should be the guiding force in political life. He argues that this practical knowledge forms the basis for interpreting the past and for shaping and presenting current ideas and opinions. It's busy here today. It's normally really quiet, but I think we have the start of the Christmas light season. I'm recording this on the 1st of December, and I think the whole place is opening up with its Christmas lights festival tonight and for 3 or 4 weeks. Anyway, back to Edmund Burke. It's important to understand that Burke's concept of government extends beyond the current generation. It actually encompasses both past and future generation. He sees the government of the people as a partnership, but not only among the living, but also with those who have passed away and those that have yet been born. The wisdom that's been passed down through the generations, handed on, stewarded, and then passed into the future. This traditional perspective emphasizes that governments are not and should be not seen as just fleeting arrangement based on current social whims and fashions, but are in fact part of a living contract inherited from ancestors and entrusted to be passed on to future generations. This position is contrary to Locke and Hobbes. I think I've done previous bonus episodes on. Burke, you see, entirely dismisses the idea of starting politically from scratch. Instead, he views society as a living contract that we inherited from our ancestors, and he stresses the responsibility to preserve that heritage for future generations, which would, of course, in his mind at that time, include the Christian worldview. This challenges the notion of a static social contract, but underscores the ongoing nature of consent and the continual remaking of that contract, if you like. Burke, in his writing, frequently highlighted the concept of the fear of God as being a stabilizing force in the government of a country. And one could also argue that the government and fundamental aspects of it thereby lie within the individual's personal faith and the moral compass. And that would have to be, say, across denominational differences. He believed that a leader, irrespective of their religious affiliation, maintained a sense of accountability to a higher power. It then aligned with Burke's belief in the importance of divine guidance. Burke's view that society continually redefines human nature within its historical context echoes a somewhat, one might say, proto-postmodernist perspective. Of course, this challenges the idea of fixed human nature, which may cause some Christians problems, and suggests that our understanding of what humanity is, in fact, evolves over time. This perspective aligns with the notion that human nature is not predetermined but shaped by various incidences and influences. He would, of course, include God in that, but also nature, education, and heritage. Considering the recent decline of Christianity in modern times, Burke might be seen of this ongoing compromise and the endless negotiation with society in the process of trying to find a common ground, one that is adrift from divine perspectives. So in doing so, he kind of challenges the notion at one level of a fixed human nature, suggesting that it's continual, defined within the context of the current history. Even so, each individual is seen as an element in the unfolding of God's will, with their nature shaped by multiple aspects, things like heritage, tradition, and of course God's divine plan, providential plan for them in the future. His was very much a local-based conservatism It recognised greatly the importance of family, neighbourhood, church and various community associations as foundational elements of society. Burke argues that engaging with people at the grassroots level is where everything practical every day takes place, emphasising relationships and happiness and human flourishing all comes from this perspective. He has this idea of something he calls little platoons. It's basically talking about the fact that most, if not all of the good stuff we experience in society, in fact happens at a local level. Forget, he says, the fancy theories, the highfalutin thoughts. Burke wants to look at our neighbours, our communities and our own lives to experience the real deal, so to speak. He's all about human connections and sharing human values in our everyday interactions. It's a down-to-earth approach. Unlike some pretty political and big ideas that can seem pretty abstract. And the interesting thing is that in Burke's principles, things are never set in stone. They roll with the changes in human relationships and communities. I sense an element of this appearing in the writings and the talks, the sort of the popular cultural people who have arisen over the last years, the new Conservatives, people like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, people like Edmund Burke. Well, Peterson's famous for the concept, the idea of, before you go and try and fix the world and all its complicated problems, start with cleaning your room. I sort of see a link here with Burke's thinking, which I'd never thought about or recognised how deeply rooted in the nature of philosophy and history and psychology people like Peterson are. Anyway, let's shift gears and go back to this Burke's take on the French Revolution, which is what we were studying and talking about this week. His criticism of it, well, probably because he did look and have the worldview totally through a Christian lens, is he saw it as flawed. He was never sold on this revolutionary dream of building a perfect society, thinking any such big ideas like this were always going to be flawed. Burke, you see, was all about preserving the moral and social traditions, those things that from his point of view, and we would say as Christians today, have been around forever. The Christian perspective puts a premium on moral virtues and sticking to the teachings of the Bible. French Revolution's attempt to shake the status quo to the very core and start afresh and ditch those things didn't sit well with Burke. He thought it was a risky move away from the path of moral goodness. Now, Burke was never weaving any traditional sort of single denominational flag, but he does give a nod of agreement to the idea of morality and order being distilled in a religious worldview, which of course for him would have meant nothing else but the Christian perspective. Burke's whole thinking about order and stability sits in line with the Christian principle of respecting authority, especially when it lines up with moral values. It's like saying if something is morally sound, we should keep it steadily and orderly. Wow, what a beautiful day. I hope you're enjoying the beauty of the place around us. I was going to say all the autumn colours, but last night the temperature plunged to -3 and we have this beautiful frost everywhere. Anyway, back to Burke. Burke's whole thinking, I believe, about order and stability is all about the Christian idea of respecting authority, especially when it comes to moral values. And he greatly believed if something is morally sound, let's keep it, don't throw it out like the French Revolution did. In a nutshell, while Burke's reflection on France doesn't scream sort of theology or Christian principle at it, it does have underpinning it definite Christian friendly themes, if you like. He's all about morality and keeping things in order, and also recognizing the not so perfect side of human nature. So at one hand, he sort of almost seems to deny the immutability of original sin, but at the same time recognizes that not so perfect side of human nature, so to speak. So to wrap up Burke's take on nature, society, conservatism, it's all about getting local. He's into the nitty-gritty of people focusing on these aspects of life. And guess what? Isn't that pretty relevant today? Burke's vision for a society, I think, is a 3-part ethic of peace, combined with divine order, and the bit that we'd struggle with today, that is of manners. It's all about sticking to traditions and using those to keep things stable. In his views, these values are the backbone of a well-ordered and a society that will last. Of course, in Burke's day, a traditional society had the aristocracy as their caretakers, ensuring that things stayed steady. Tradition for them was also the key, and naturally they weren't keen on any excessive freedom, particularly when they saw where it led to with the French Revolution. But for Burke, freedom is only right if it's played out in good order, peace, and of course this thing he calls manners, actually doing things that are good for society. He never calls for freedom's sake, like other thinkers like Locke, who were saying the same thing, but of course were all about individual rights. When it came to the French Revolution, he says, yeah, we need to keep one eye on it and what we can learn from it, and what these newfound liberties mean. But he says we need to hold on. We need to see how they handle this freedom within their actual government that comes out of it. And he said, let's take a hands-off approach when it comes to thinking about liberty, freedom, and what it can really bring when applied at this level in terms of delivering stability and a moral state. Now, of course, in our current days, in our modern scene, Burke's trio of peace, order, and manners make us wonder out the values about how we might steer society today. The idea between individual liberties and their greater good is still a hot topic. Burke's viewpoint gives us many different angles and perspectives to ponder. Burke's big on looking at what comes out of the governance of these ideas of freedom. He's not about just the lofty ideas. He's checking if the government's values bring about things like peace and order. He even thinks we need to monitor the flow of wealth and see if it really makes an impact on people's lives following something like that. And if you throw morality and Christianity into the mix, Burke says that our shared ethical principles and the Christian faith are the thing that holds society, government together. He's not about some vague idea of freedom or liberty. He wants to see the outworking of it pulling its weight in bringing order and good to people at all times, well, for everyone. It's kind of like a prophecy of the idea we see today, where it said that one person's freedom can mean someone else losing their rights. And here's the kicker. For Burke, how government have got to have its economic game in order to do the job right. He's all for legitimate taxes and a practical approach to government, measuring success by how well it takes care of his people, which led him to the position of supporting the American Revolution's idea of no taxation without representation. We're in the garden now. Not sure if you can see it because the sun's so low in the sky at this time of year. Anyway. thinking about how this perspective has played out in history. If we look at the likes of post-Soviet Russia and its accumulation of the Russian states, or our recent Iraqi and Afghanistani interventions, you can see that Burke's skepticism, if you like, about forcing our social structures on societies is probably flawed. He's all about this thing called the living contract, where values are passed down and kept safe and built on bit by bit over time. I think he would say that trying to drop Western-style democracies on other places like Iraq or Afghanistan in our day, well, he might say, hold up on that. Our view may not match their traditions and may cause more problem than good. Burke's philosophy sounds a cautionary note to such adventures. He believed that societal values and structures can only organically evolve from within the community. He's all about gradual change, believing the lasting stability comes from preserving and inheriting those values. It also, for me, would mean very much in line with Paul's perspective of not trying to change things and outlaw things like the approach to slavery, but rather by first introducing people to the gospel and the way of God, thereby lives and the whole system and the idea of slavery will be undermined naturally by it. He does acknowledge the universal aspiration for human rights, and Burke would likely argue that recognising and implementing those rights should be rooted in each society's traditions and values. It's a balancing act between the universal principle and the unique cultural context of different communities. His scepticism towards unbridled free speech, as he saw it in the French Revolution, he believed would lead to a release of restraint. And for Burke, these restraints aren't limitations, but essential for maintaining order and stability and shared value. In the religious context too, the Christian perspective, we can see rules and restraints as revealed by God's word as providing a framework that actually creates freedom and harmony for everyone. But here's the kicker on all this. Figuring out who and how we should set the limits is the real challenge. It is still today. In a society where values change around us and different political ideologies hold power, those defining these limits might not align with everyone's beliefs. This raises the question of whoever those advocating for restraints on free speech, are we still going to support them and allow it if those people and their positions don't share our values? Burke's conservatism is rooted in the traditional institutions of his day, which in his day was, of course, the government, represented by the landed interests, the crown and the church. His caution about the potential misuse of power and the need to consider who gets it and who should decide on the limits of free speech and how they should align with principles of liberty and order. So thinking about today's ever politically changing landscape, Burke's philosophy encourages us to reflect on the consequences of unrestrained free speech and how to maintain a delicate balance between individual liberties and the need for order in a society. We can't escape the fact that Burke's perspective on who should decide these societal limits and constraints is deeply rooted in his belief of the stabilised aristocracy. According to him, the aristocracy are the ones who have the vested interest in the continuation of a well-ordered society and the maintenance of its stability. This perspective, and on one level, aligns with the idea that certain classes of people, by virtue of their social status and even just their inherited position, are better equipped to guide a society. his famous quote, "What is liberty without wisdom and without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils, for it is a folly, vice, and madness without tuition or restraint." Burke ties the idea of freedom to wisdom and virtue. And of course, by doing that, he has a profound understanding of the Christian idea of freedom, always needing to be tempered by moral responsibility. He sees aristocrats as stewards of societal order, emphasizing their responsibility for stability rooted in God's intended plan. Where that can be applied today with no aristocracy is really interesting, because I would suggest it should give us confidence as Christian believers to accept roles of influence where we can in our societies and in our situations. Today, of course, we would question the very idea of an aristocracy. We wouldn't even think that that was an inherently conservative value. And we would see no way an aristocracy could in any way address any form of injustice in society. But Burke in his day, he trusted the upper classes and believed that property ownership was the thing that tempered radicalism. And he, in a sense, raised property rights over and above most ways of allowing people to be engaged in the society they're in. I wonder and suspect if Margaret Thatcher's perspective was any way fueled by this perspective when she did the right to buy scheme among the state-held council properties in the land in the 1970s and 80s. Anyway, to sum it up a bit, Burke certainly understood human fallibility. His foresight of where the French Revolution would lead is almost prophetic. Burke's quotes and his views on the French Revolution reflects the Christian views on both sin and humility before a holy God. His perspective at those times is not explicitly Christian. It certainly is bedded in, appreciates the moral and virtuous qualities in a nation when it is aligned with biblical teachings on righteousness, sin, and all the other stalwarts of our faith. Alongside that, Burke's emphasis on practical wisdom and gradual change, and the fact that these things should be done locally, starting with the man in the mirror, align with the biblical teaching on righteousness. His insights into the danger of radical change provide a counterbalance to extreme ideologies. Hello. Today, whether we have debates on practical wisdom, gradual change, local politics, they all resonate. His insights on the danger of radical change, as exemplified in his book on the French Revolution, provide a counterbalance to all extreme ideologies. All attempts to reconstruct a whole new economic system and world order before, to quote Jordan Peterson, we've even tidied our room. Debates on government or individual rights, even societal values, they persist today. They stimulate the internet. They're all over the internet. But I believe the benefit from considering what I've gained from reading Burke's book and talking about him this week, for me, very simply, is his ideas encourage a balanced, context-specific approach to anything where you would want to bring about societal change on those around you. His writings have caused me to reflect on where governance and tradition and how they've risen out of the biblical worldview, but the complexities of that continuing societal evolution that carries on to this day. I think it was worth taking the time to read it, worth taking the time to think about it, And these are just my notes and thoughts that enabled me to go to that discussion group and hopefully frame it within a little bit of a Christian biblical worldview at times. And anyway, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed our walk and talk together through the grounds of Lytham Hall in Lancashire. And I do hope you'll join me again and give me some feedback if you'd like me to see more, do more of this sort of walk and talk. And you get a chance to get a glimpse of Ella, my lab, who also enjoys these walks and talks. And I look forward to seeing you back again here very soon. Bye-bye for now.